Poetry has a rich tradition, of course, all over the Islamic world, but Iraq seems to be especially blessed with great poets.
Yes. No, poetry was so powerful that there are many who argue that it kind of delayed the emergence of prose narratives in Iraq. But definitely, I mean, it has to do with the fact that the beginning of the Islamic Empire, the standardization of the Arabic language took place in Iraq, in the cities of Kufa and Basra, and Baghdad was the center of the world for many centuries, and the bulk of quote-unquote classical literature in Arabic was produced in Iraq. But also I think what's important is the modern state of Iraq and its educational system. And for a variety of reasons that I can't go through now, but basically access to good education and access to translated literature and a sense of the power of history, not only Arabo-Islamic but Mesopotamian, and that the first revolt of modernist Arabic poetry took place in Iraq in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So Iraqi poets changed the way Arabic poetry is written. They were influenced by English and American poetry and changed all the meters. So Iraq really for the longest time until very recently was the place for Arabic poetry, and Iraqi poets dominated all the genres and continue to do so until today.
So clearly, Sinan, the growing up in a culture where poetry was written and recited and played a huge part in people's lives had an impact on you. You became a poet after all. If you can remember one of your poems, would you mind reciting it?
Definitely. This one is called Wars. When I was struck by war, I took a brush immersed in death, and on the war's wall I drew a window. I opened it, searching for a tomorrow or for anything, but all I saw was another war and a mother weaving a shroud for the dead man still in her womb.
Sinan, in your book, The Poetics of the Obscene, you write about the 10th century poet Ibn al-Hajj, which brings to mind this very rich, unmined tradition of early Arab literature. And this is Arab literature which goes completely against the stereotypes of Islam, which are today imposed on the world, both by the West, but also by the jihadis and fundamentalists. Tell us a bit about this book and Ibn al-Hajj.
Well, I came across the name in a footnote of a book that said this is Ibn al-Hajj, the most obscene poet in the history of Arabic literature. And I was surprised because I had not heard of him. In all of my years of studying, we had never heard of Ibn al-Hajj, and upon doing more research, I discovered that this man was quite famous and was a giant in his time in the 10th century, and was highly respected by the poets and by the critics, and was very successful, and his fame reached all the way to Islamic Spain and to Egypt, and he continued to be famous until the 19th century when he begins to disappear from literary history. So, in addition to his poetry being very fascinating because he pioneered a new genre of scatological parody, he took every convention in Arabic poetry and turned it upside down and fused dictions and registers using colloquial Baghdadi language with the High Arabic, using Persian and Aramaic, but also poking fun at serious literature, serious poetry, poking fun at religion in ways that if he were alive today, he would be killed so very quickly. So it was a perfect example for me of the cultural amnesia and the erasure, which is the product of the encounter with modernity, and both the hegemony of Western traditions and Orientalism, whereby, as you just mentioned, that the history that many Muslims and Arabs believe is their history is actually a constructed history that has been edited like every other history. And when it comes to the issues of sexuality and erotica, it's actually the Victorian values of the Orientalists who studied. So for example, one of the Orientalists who came across Ibn al-Hajjaj said that this is unworthy of scholarship because it's, to quote him, acres of dreary filth. But the pre-modern critics were more enlightened, because a lot of them said, you know, the subject matter might be disgusting, but what matters here is the craftsmanship. And so when I tell my other colleagues who study European literature, they say, oh, he was the Rabelais of his age. But in reality, this man preceded Rabelais and preceded the others. So it was one attempt to, you know, bring back this one incident to show how we need to completely reconsider and rediscover this Arabo-Islamic past, and, you know, be wary and mindful of the identities that were imposed in the 19th century. And that when it came to sexuality, and when it came actually even to, and you know this very well, of course, in terms of free thinking and critique of religion.
How much of al-Hajjaj's poetry survived?
Well, some of it survived in fragments, so he was very prolific, and, you know, the history of the destruction of Baghdad by invaders meant that we lost a lot of manuscripts, but his manuscripts, fragments of them survived, and enough survived, and a Tunisian publisher about 14 years ago published a selection of his poems. Yeah, and there was an Egyptian scholar who in the 70s or 80s did edited a section of the Diwan of the collected poems. It's an Iraqi scholar by the name of Ali Jawad al-Tahir in the 50s did a master's degree at the Sorbonne, where he edited the collection but didn't publish it at the time, he said in his book, because perhaps society was not really ready. There is a problematic way of looking at literature and a certain conservatism, even when it comes to scholars of Arabic literature. But to my mind, he's a unique figure. And it also tells us a lot about social life in Baghdad at the time, because he became the market inspector. So in a lot of his poems, he gives us, we get the texture of the life of the market, and because he was interested in the underworld, we get a very unique picture of a metropolitan city in the 10th century.
And of course, he was not alone in that period. We have two other striking instances. One is the woman, Arab woman poetess, Valada, in Cordoba,
yes,
who wrote very explicitly about her lovers, about sexuality, rather in a derogatory way about one of her lovers, a great Arab poet, Ibn Zaydun, who, when he became a homosexual, some of the stuff she wrote about him today would be considered unacceptable. But it was very powerful stuff. And then you already mentioned Al-Mari, but you know, the poet who appears in the 1001 Nights, Abu Nuwas, during the time of the Khalifa Harun al-Rashid, is openly gay. I mean, there's no doubt if you read his poetry, when he writes describing the limbs of boys and their bodies. And
he's also the master of wine poetry. I mean, what irritates me a lot in the West is how, you know, in newspapers, they're always surprised and tell us that wine is banned by Islam. Yes, but the most extensive tradition of wine poetry is in Arabic and in Persian.
Khamriya.
Yes. And I should say that, of course, in Baghdad, one of the most beautiful streets by the river was named after Abu Nuwas, and there is a statue of him in Baghdad. But sadly, recently, the sectarian government and forces want to change the name of the street because it harks back to a different past, not the one that they want to celebrate.
And this is the government today?
Yeah.
So when did the change come, if we look at Islamic culture? I mean, there's a big debate, as you know, among scholars, when the Arab Renaissance ended. Some say the 11th century, some say the 12th century.
You know, it's very problematic because that superimposes a European model on Arabo-Islamic history. So there was this so-called theory of the decline. So somehow, you know, after the fall of Baghdad and after that, there are these centuries of decline. Of course, that's deployed so that the coming of the West would be some kind of rebirth. But recent scholarship into the Mamluk and other periods shows that there was a vibrant, interesting culture and that nothing really ceased to exist. I mean, I think the change is in the 18th and 19th century, as I mentioned, when, you know, there is an erasure and a destruction of certain discourses, and there are other discourses that are implanted. But I, you know, if I had another lifetime, I would look into the 14th, the early modern period is quite fascinating, especially in a place like Egypt and Syria, but in Iraq as well. I mean, you know, there is this myth, of course, that after the fall of Baghdad, there was nothing. But you look and actually, many schools were built, many intellectual traditions were developed, there was poetry that was written. The prose that was written now is being studied seriously, and we realize, of course, that it was a continuous, vibrant, interesting culture, as one should assume in any other place.
And during the period when the Arab lands were part of the Ottoman Empire, this more or less continued because they didn't put a stop to this.
No, of course. I mean, just recently I came across a fascinating poet from the 17th century in Baghdad. But again, we go back to that, you know, some of these works, some of these manuscripts were edited and were studied, but not sufficiently, and we haven't had a respite. Of course, here we come to the negative consequences of certain strands of Arab nationalism or Baathism, whereby they're quashing anything that has to do with the Ottomans. And it's also internalizing this European superiority, whereby it's the coming of Britain to Iraq which ushers in the modern age, even though actually modern Baghdad owes a lot of its developments to its last Ottoman ruler, who put in a system of the post system and transportation. So, I mean, sadly, in Iraq, you know, it would be a luxury now to go back and look at the Ottoman period. But there are a number of historians, Arabs and others, who are now examining the Ottoman period from a non-nationalistic point of view to be able to understand the modern period.
Sinan, could al-Hajj exist today in the Islamic world? This is a question.
No, sadly, I actually end my book by saying, sadly, if Ibn al-Hajjaj would be beheaded or would be censored and silenced if he were alive today. I mean, the sense of amnesia is that when I went to the National Archive in Egypt to ask to look at one of his manuscripts, that the person there did not know of him, and many people did not know of him because he's been excised out of the literary history.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much.